I just want to speak very briefly about what this series is all about and how it came into being. Last semester, as many of you will know, we began a 3-semester long investigation into the ideas of beauty, goodness and truth, ideas that constituted the very basis of the existence of USD when it was founded in 1949. Famously, when Mother Rosalie Hill described what she envisioned would be the impact of USD on students, she said, this is a quote that you all know, beauty will attract them, goodness will lead them, but the truth will hold them. And our intention in formulating this series has been to devote an entire semester to an investigation into each of these founding principles. Last semester, our focus was on beauty. This semester, we explore goodness, and in the spring of 2019, we'll turn our attention to truth. It's going to be a particularly challenging exercise in what might be called the age of Giuliani. So the question that always arises is, why do we do this in 3 semesters? Why make this so drawn out and long-winded? And it's worth going over this again. I'm basically going to repeat some of the things that I said last spring. So if you were there, you can sort of fiddle with your phones or whatever things you want to do. You know, when we first flirted with the idea of this series, the thought was that we might have just one session on the entire topic of beauty, goodness and truth. We'd have a kind of panel where we thought about these ideas and what they meant, linking this all to the Catholic intellectual tradition that underlies USD's liberal arts commitment, where we could have done that, and it would have been really very easy to manage at least. But to do that would have been to promote a kind of insidious illusion that these ideas are all very straightforward, uncomplicated, and uncontroversial. But of course they're not. These concepts are essentially contested. So it's never going to be enough blithely to talk over the phone, blithely to talk about the value of beauty, goodness and truth, or to emblazon these words isolated on banners or web pages. Once we've isolated that these ideas have something to do with the mission and foundation of USD, the heavy lifting work still has to be done. And this 3-semester series is part of that heavy lifting work. It's also important to emphasize in that context that an active understanding of this nature takes time and has to be patient. It's not effortless and it's not easy. Ludwig Wittgenstein, certainly one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, held as one of his informal maxims, and I quote Wittgenstein, "Always go the bloody long way round." This is a great remark. Always go the bloody long way round. And going the bloody long way round in the context of what we did last semester involved looking into the idea of beauty from a range of perspectives, philosophical, theological, artistic, scientific, subjecting it to critique and understanding it in all of its multifaceted and historically determined complexity. And the same will be the case this semester with regard to the idea of goodness. We've put together what I think promises to be a really compelling series. I really encourage you to pick up the flyer that's at the front desk and to lock Tuesday afternoons into your calendar. Now, speakers in this series, and I'm happy to see a great many of them actually here today, speakers in this series will address the conflicting contributions to our understanding of goodness made by such seminal thinkers as Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Mill, Nietzsche, and G. Moore, how widely differing religious traditions formulate their ideas of goodness, whether human beings should be regarded as being good, or conversely, somewhat wicked, whether creation itself can be seen as good or as a curse, what it means to say that a work of art is good, and what contribution to these debates can be made by the natural sciences. In today's opening session, we're going to take a broad view of the whole subject and look at some of the connections that are from time to time drawn between beauty, goodness and truth. Now, joining me to discuss these matters are two vital members of the Humanities Center team, Derrick Cartwright and Sara Hasselbach. I'll just say a word about each of my co-presenters. Derrick Cartwright is Director of USD's University Galleries and an Associate Professor in the Department of Art, Architecture and Art History. Dr. Cartwright received his PhD from the University of Michigan, and he's been a museum director in Giverny, Hanover, New Hampshire, San Diego and Seattle. Sara Hasselbach is postdoctoral fellow in the Department of English. She's also the Humanities Center plenipotentiary. That's a word you don't hear every day. Check it out. Sara received her PhD from Tufts University. We'll be hearing from Derrick and Sara shortly, but before that I just want to say a few words about the general linking of beauty, goodness and truth. Why do these things get linked together? Why are they connected rather than in tension with one another so that they can form a nice trio, the foundation for a university and so on? And again, this is part of a kind of a blitheness that we think these things so obviously go together, and perhaps they do not go together. Now, here's Roger Scruton. Always good to see Roger Scruton. He's a British philosopher, and we've got a fascinating little book on beauty. He discusses this issue, considering, first of all, the notion that what these three have got in common, beauty, truth, and goodness, is that they are ultimate values. Scruton says that an ultimate value is something we pursue or something we value for its own sake. So beauty, goodness and truth, Scruton considers, might be seen as, what he says, is a trio of ultimate values which justify our rational inclinations. This is what this shows. These are Scruton's words. Why believe P? Because it's true. Why want X? Because it is good. Why look at Y? Because it is beautiful. So beauty, goodness and truth here justify our inclinations and our pursuit. This idea of these three as ultimate values can be given theological backing by the claims of thinkers in the tradition of Plotinus, who claim that truth, beauty and goodness are attributes of God, ways in which the deity makes itself known to the human soul. In such a manner, the status of each of these three things can be seen as ultimate, and, of course, they can be seen as entirely compatible, coexisting harmoniously in the divine being. There's one way you can approach it. Scruton, however, and he's not alone in this, wants to indicate that beauty actually stands in a very problematic relation to both goodness and truth. His examples are well chosen, and they deserve to be noted. From Kierkegaard to Oscar Wilde, the aesthetic way of life, in which beauty is pursued as the supreme value, has been opposed to the life of virtue. The love of myths, stories and rituals, the need for consolation and harmony, the deep desire for order, all have drawn people to religious beliefs, regardless of whether those beliefs are true. The prose of Flaubert, the imagery of Baudelaire, the harmonies of Wagner, the sensuous forms of Canova, have all been accused of immorality by those who believe that they paint wickedness in alluring colours. So we can pause a little bit over each of these tensions. Beauty can be in tension with goodness when we are seduced into immorality and wrongdoing by something or someone that is beautiful, attractive or alluring. Scruton's examples focus on the dangerous allure of artistic or literary beauty. But of course, we can think ourselves of cases in which a person's moral compass is destroyed by their infatuation with a beautiful person. Someone they desire who leads them awfully astray. This is such a perennial and dramatic danger of human life that's become a staple of the creative imagination. Classic literary example of this, of course, is Abbé Prévost's novel Manon Lescaut, in which the respectable life of the Chevalier d'Aigre is brought into confusion and ultimately to ruin by his obsession with the beautiful but morally empty Manon. This, of course, is the subject of 2 operas. If you can name the composers of those 2 operas, on your way out, you get a prize. Moving on, beauty can be in tension with truth in a whole host of ways. Scruton notes how the beautifully ordered nature of religious systems, and to this we may add political ideologies and other holistic systems of ideas, have an appeal which blind the eyes of devotees to evidence of that system's falsehood. And philosophical critics of art, from Plato onwards, have often alerted us to its dissembling nature. For example, Jeremy Bentham's disdain for poetry is cast in the following terms. This is from the Rationale of Reward. Bentham hated poetry, of course. He hated poetry so much. Everyone knows this line from Bentham about what the difference between poetry and prose is. Poetry, Bentham says, is where some of the lines don't go as far as the margins. And that was it. Bentham hates it. Between poetry and truth, there is a natural opposition: false morals, fictitious nature. The poet always stands in need of something false. When he pretends to lay his foundations in truth, the ornaments of his superstructure are fictions. His business consists in stimulating our passions and exciting our prejudices. This is the important line. Truth, exactitude of every kind, is fatal to poetry. Even more spectacularly than this, I suppose, the Freudian theory of art declares that art arises because artists and viewers cannot tolerate the cold and painful truths of reality. They prefer instead a sanitized and beautified version of things. To use Milan Kundera's memorable term, art constitutes a beautifying lie. Now you can think of your own examples of this dissembling beautification, though the deaths of operatic heroines are prime cases. You can think of your own examples here. The heroine of an opera suffering from consumption nonetheless sings perfectly, and we're spared all the blood and coughing. Puccini is the master of this type of nonsense. Now, on the face of it, tensions between truth and goodness are not so noticeable. However, as any philosophy major will tell you, it doesn't go without saying that a good person is one who is committed to always telling the truth. For a certain species of moral theorists, there will be occasions in which telling a lie might be the right or the good thing. So here truth and goodness can come into conflict. Now, I've neither the time nor the inclination to get into any of that material in great depth. The purpose of what I just said is to indicate that beauty, goodness, and truth do not necessarily sit together seamlessly, that there are enormous controversies to work through, and that the complexity of each of these ideas and their relations to each other require precisely the lengthy exploration we've chosen to undertake. It's a vindication of that approach. With that, I want to hand things over to my co-panelists, first of whom, Dr. Derrick Cartwright.
Thank you, Brian, first for the invitation to participate in this series and also for the opportunity to collaborate with you on all the activities of the gallery and the Humanities Center. I should say that what follows is a meditation more than an introduction, I'm afraid, and this talk stems from research aimed at exploring intersections between the aesthetic commitments of pop imagery, the unexpected adjacencies between artists as seemingly diverse as Andy Warhol and Sister Creta Kent, and some fairly general ideas that I have about what might be said to count as goodness across humanistic disciplines. Kent's work for Eleanor is what I chose to begin with here, and to which I will return eventually. Almost as an aside, while preparing this talk, I was surprised to notice that many of the representations I selected happened to have been made in the same year. And just why this should be, I haven't fully figured out yet, sorry. But without claims to certain or lasting significance, this talk is called On the Edge of Goodness, circa 1964. In his essay, Self-Reliance, Ralph Waldo Emerson famously suggested, your goodness must have some edge to it, else it's none. Exactly what Emerson meant by this claim merits further contextualization, if only to avoid the appearance of pure snarkiness. And Emerson was full of laments, but hardly ever practiced snark. Just before this much-quoted section of his text, however, he asked his reader, if malice and vanity wear the coat of philanthropy, shall that pass? If an angry bigot assumes the bountiful call of abolition and comes to me with the latest news of Barbados, why should I not go say to him, go love thy infant, love thy woodchopper, be good-natured and modest, have that grace, and never varnish your hard, uncharitable ambition with this incredible tenderness for black folk 1,000 miles off. Thy love afar is spite at home. Then Emerson appears for a moment to think better, but just for a moment. He says, rough and graceless would be such a greeting. Yeah, I think so. But truth is handsomer than the affectation of love. And here he says, your goodness must have some edge to it, else it's none. And this seems to me right, and poignantly so today. I'm drawn to Emersonian defenses of tough love, or more properly, brooking no love and calling things as they truly are in contest between feigned goodness and outright hypocrisy. But can academic discourse ever be so direct? My hope, not just here, but for the whole of this series, is that we will end up with a working sense of goodness that goes further than blind labeling to look at what's at stake and applying the term to situations across the humanities and beyond. Goodness with an edge. I'm an art historian, and for a while now I've been thinking about some images that circulated widely in the early 1960s, and these were critical years for the emergence of pop art. The Pasadena Art Museum's exhibition, New Paintings for Common Objects, took place in 1962 and really inaugurated pop art's presence not just on the West Coast, but for a global audience. But also other forms of representation, including color field painting, performance, minimalism, and conceptual art practices. And my point is that homogeneity was far from a defining feature of the common visual culture. Indeed, pop art meant and looked different in New York from what it meant and looked like in London, and Paris, Berlin, Sao Paulo, and Istanbul. Just as New Painting for Common Objects brought together artists today thought as different as Andy Warhol and Wayne Thiebaud, Roy Lichtenstein, and Ed Ruscha. Here I'm showing you Wayne Thiebaud's version of an ice cream cone as Renaissance phallus, and the contemporary mass media sources that promoted such specific imagery, soft and simple without edges, as pure goodness to large sectors of the public. How might we best connect this proliferation of goodness to beauty, and in the future to episodes of truth? Last semester, some of you may recall, we talked in this room about beauty, and I tried then to suggest that the term's limitless dimensions, shorn as they may be in traditional aesthetics, must broaden to fit certain categories of late 20th century and contemporary art. Inaugurating this afternoon's session on goodness, I'm reminded again how Eva Hesse's, and this is Eva Hesse, effort to make absurdity a viable category for evaluating her sculpture in no way prevented her work from being judged beautiful or lastingly good. Edgy, to be sure, but achingly beautiful nevertheless. Hesse's project requires us to adjust our habits and our values that we bring to making, citing, and assessing three-dimensional art. And in considering this well, it takes us to finer understandings of what is good in our lives. In so doing, it hardly asks anything new from Edmund Burke's formulations of the beautiful and the sublime. James Brown, like Hesse, had Emersonian edge to spare, and like her, would never let someone else's judgments inhibit the rough, personal edge he gives to senses of beauty, inventories of goodness, which is precisely the path we'll be traveling along in this series. Remember, wrongness is protected by goodness in the worldview promoted by Brown's smash hit, I Got You. There is just the same an implicit tension in Brown's encircling arms which forbids wrongs or harms and the suggestion that things are not always guaranteed to be so nice. That's edge. With it, this 1964 single soared to number 3 on the pop music charts shortly after its release and remains the artist's best-known recording today. And my goal for now is not to tease out contradictions embedded in this song, although I might like to on another occasion. Instead, the best I'll manage is to roughly sketch the historical context for goodness that I Got You and other enduring representations of the period suggest. As it was last time, my point of departure remains Ellen Scarry's text on beauty and being just. This book originated from the Tanner Lectures on Human Values that Scarry delivered at Yale University from 1997 to 1998. And in that slim volume, the Harvard literature professor argues first and foremost that beautiful things reverberate and seek replication in our lives. I tell you that the new Spike Lee film is beautiful and you go out and see it. Scarry encounters anew to her painting by Henri Matisse and decides spontaneously to draw it herself. She further asserts that beauty is inextricably allied with truth. She says, quote, "The beautiful acquaints us with the mental event of conviction, and so pleasurable a mental state is this that ever afterwards one is willing to labor, struggle, wrestle with the world to locate enduring sources of conviction, to locate what is true." End quote. Truth, and by extension justice, is a logical and I think phenomenological outcome of felt beauty. Speaking personally, I'm persuaded by these arguments and believe they can be durably applied to works of art from any period. Throughout On Beauty and Being Just, goodness is baked into the pavement that leads us to awareness beyond self-interest, on to practical requirements for social justice. Scarry writes how gazing is good for solving problems of lateral disregard, which is her answer to the complaint that looking at beautiful things is solipsistic or narcissistic and a distraction from interrogating more pressing problems. An extraordinary thing, poem, person, or theorem places us, according to Scarry, in the demands, it without our invitation. This is very important to her, that we're not invited to do this, it happens on its own. Places us and the pressure it exerts toward extending the same standard laterally. She continues, the fact that it may be one beholder who is singing the praise onto the first object, while it is a second beholder who is, though in harmony, is now demanding that love be equally accorded to a lateral object, should not discourage us from seeing the two as a composite event sponsored by the beautiful object itself. That's a lot of work, for goodness' sake. Not everyone is a fan of Scarry's book. Reviewing On Beauty and Being Just for readers of the American Prospect, the cultural historian Todd Gitlin concedes, it's a lovely book, convincing as a tribute to Homer, Dante, Wittgenstein, Proust, and Matisse. But, Gitlin advises, in the end, beauty must speak for itself, however inconveniently. We cherish beautiful things not because they make us better people, this is still Gitlin, but because they are beautiful and we love them. To insist that their beauty is also conducive to justice is another utilitarian argument of the sort that is especially familiar in America. Beauty should be freed from the demand that it accomplish anything other than beauty. It should not have to work for a living, end quote. So to me, Gitlin's feels like the oldest and tiredest estimate of what beauty might be called upon to do in and for society, one that ignores generations of creative problem solving both before and since Matisse. More simply, where's the edge to this antiquated idea of beauty in which slavish service to abstract goodness is all that matters? So I make room for this question because it seems to me sure that critics of Gitlin's caliber actually have better, more complex experiences to draw upon than he shows us. His credentials as a leader of the Students for a Democratic Society in the 1960s, he was the president of that group, coexists unhappily with his refusal to acknowledge the capacity of beautiful things to serve as something other than attractive leisure. Beautiful things on pedestals have a hard time knocking other things off pedestals. I should pause here and say that Gitlin was a revered professor at UC Berkeley when I was a student there. My wife is really mad about what I'm saying about him now, but that's okay. In the 1960s, artists like Andy Warhol insisted that we confront the shock of mass media through imagery, through repetition and replication. Whatever we think of Warhol today, his works from 1961 to 1968 stand out amongst the most poignant responses to turbulent times. But Gitlin barely mentions Warhol in his own book on the 60s, the cover which I'm showing you here. Instead, paradoxically, he gazes solipsistically back at his own shortcomings. This is another quote. He says, I wrote earnest poems about the need to break through to more authentic reality. I met unimaginably brave civil rights workers from SNCC and set up a rally for them at Harvard. I watched police with cattle prods and dogs attack Birmingham demonstrators on television and felt guilty about not doing enough. Warhol actually did something. Practically speaking, Birmingham Race Riot was one of the first silkscreen prints that Warhol ever produced, testing it first in 1963 and producing an edition of 500 the following year. And notwithstanding the $63 million price that a version of this work fetched in Christie's auction in May of 2014, it remains one of the artist's most enduring and direct protests of American culture throughout the civil rights era. My goal here is not to lionize Andy Warhol. Warhol was a media hound, but used his celebrity and borrowed celebrity of others to rivet the attention of a bored art world through the multiplication of disasters within the great society of Kennedy's first years in office. After Kennedy's assassination, immortalized in Warhol's next great series of Jackie paintings, Warhol relentlessly honed in on the contradictions that ran throughout Johnson's single term as president. Another way to think about Warhol's practice across these years would be to say that he made history paintings that were difficult to assimilate, except when understood in terms of edgy goodness. Bob Dylan, who despised Warhol, was on the same track of cultural critique at the same time. In awkward phrasing that mirrors Warhol's off-register silkscreen strategy, Dylan made a parallel case for crises of faith and leadership. The line that completes the rhyme in this stanza of "It's all right, Ma, I'm only bleeding," first performed in 1964 is, "But even the President of the United States sometimes must have to stand naked." Scary thought then and now. Dylan's other songs of this era, like Desolation Row, as art historian Thomas Crow has pointed out, inescapably call to mind Warhol's Race Riot and Electric Chair. Crow goes on to draw a parallel between the left populist inheritance of Dylan and the pointed transformations of mundane but gruesome photographs within Warhol's factory at this time. Warhol's strategy was complex. As the late philosopher Arthur Danto has suggested, it amounted to constructing a discursive wall around traditional expectations for the beautiful and then placing his work deliberately, stubbornly, resolutely beyond that pale. Explaining why this would be so would take us much longer than a presentation like this one, and I promise I'm wrapping up. But when asked about his decisions to make 32 identically sized but not identically labeled hand-screened depictions of Campbell's soup, Warhol replied in his characteristic deadpan, because it was what he had had for lunch every day for 20 years, and it was always the same and always good. Among the artists most directly influenced by Warhol's approach to pop goodness was Frances Elizabeth Kent, better known to us as Sister Corita Kent. She first saw Warhol's soup cans at a July 1962 exhibition in Los Angeles, which is to say she saw them the first time that anybody could see them, and recounted how, coming home from the Ferris Gallery, you saw everything like Warhol. In 1964, after the 36-year-old nun became chair of the art department at the Immaculate Heart College, she promoted the school's Mary's Day Festival with pop-inspired, unconventional, hippie pageantry. Related to this, her silkscreen of that year, which is called The Juiciest Tomato of Them All, references the Virgin Mary in the place of Warhol's generic soup can. This silkscreen was labeled blasphemous by Cardinal James McIntyre of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. But there is no irreligiousness in joy, Samuel Eisenstein, a UCLA music professor, argued back at McIntyre, but to no avail. The rebuke and other slights ultimately sent Kent on a path away from the church. But not, I would argue, away from goodness. Kent celebrated goodness formally in the last projects she completed before leaving the Immaculate Heart of Mary Order in 1968. She produced 2 psychedelic Day-Glo alphabets that year, the first called an International Signal Code Alphabet, which used the Doors' contemporary hit, Hello, I Love You, as a pretext to make the letter G into an invitation to let me jump in your game. And then the Damn Everything But the Circus series, which references God as a golden bell and the greatest show of worth. The letter Z of Damn Everything is reserved for Ralph Waldo Emerson and takes us back to the essay Self-Reliance, with which I started this talk. But do your thing and I shall know you, Kent quotes Emerson as saying. And if you actually go back to Self-Reliance, that's not quite right. It says, do your work and I shall know you. Do your work and you shall reinforce yourself. A man must consider what a blind man's I'm going to try that all again. A man must consider what a blind man's buff is this game of conformity. Moving away from conformity, like doing your thing or doing your work, ultimately entailed the self-conscious rejection of Kent's vows, but no deviation from the path she was already on towards goodness in her art. Kent continued to produce brightly colored, inspirational works until her death from cancer in 1986. Reflecting on both her formal departure from the Catholic Church and her illness, she wrote matter-of-factly to a friend who expressed concerns about her. She wrote, "It's good with me, and there's new life, which I don't have to tell you is painful, but worth it all." Kent's resilient goodness is enjoying a comeback. No less than 4 exhibitions have set out to reconsider Kent's lasting impact on American culture in recent years, including one very good one curated by Jeff Burns here at USD in 2016. Reviewing another of those projects, Sasha Carrera, writing for Los Angeles Review of Books, praised Kent's fearlessly independent mindset and her ability to redirect contemporary audiences' attitudes toward the beautiful and to resulting goodness. Carrera singles out this work, which is called For Eleanor again, in terms that might be mistaken for a reading of Emerson, or maybe even scary, saying that it is, quote, it perhaps best illustrates the gradual shift from reliance on goodness from above to a reliance on goodness from within. End quote. Kent, after all, was most motivated by her lateral regard for Pope John XXIII's ideas from the Vatican II in producing these late silk-screened works. That papal call to spiritual renewal led her to rethink her relationship to God and gave her courage to take on the key social justice issues of the time: Vietnam War, racism, women's rights, farm workers' rights, the war on poverty, in popularly oriented art forms. In the end, and unfailingly, Kent gave goodness its sharp edge. So nice. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I have so much to think about. I always do here, but in particular, so thank you. I also have some quibbles with Jeremy Bentham about poetry and truth and their natural opposition, which I guess I'll go into in my paper. So my paper today is entitled Beauty, Truth, and Negative Capability in the Odes of John Keats. And I've taken as a point of departure Keats's famous penultimate line in Ode on a Grecian Urn because it directly and explicitly connects the concepts of beauty and truth. As a side note, this means I will be largely bypassing the concept of goodness and following Keats's lead, trying instead to unpack the uneasy bridge between beauty and truth. I do not regret having to leave this vexed concept of goodness behind for others to deal with. So the perhaps familiar line in question reads, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know." This puzzling, maddening line has long baffled critics. What is the relationship between beauty and truth that Keats posits here? How in the poem does he define each concept? And finally, and this last line of questioning is perhaps most interesting to me, what is the philosophical effect of pitting two ambiguous concepts together in such a straightforward way? What demands, born out of a kind of productive discomfort, does he leave us readers with? And by the end of the poem, we seem to be saddled with the task of both relating and disentangling these concepts. And I'd like to start tackling these questions by doing something my students hate, which is poring over each detail of the line itself. But before doing so, I just wanted to give some general information about the poem in case people are unfamiliar with it. So odes were traditionally dedicated to the praise of an external object, characterized by apostrophe and personification, and they were often read self-reflexively. Ode on a Grecian Urn from 1819 is a 50-line poetic response to a work of art, a decorated urn, with detailed scenes involving sculpted figures. And here I've got for you a water jug, not an urn. Urns were hard to find. I should have consulted Derrick. Water jug, but it offers a sense of the kind of scene that Keats probably imagines in the poem. This poem also participates in the self-reflexive nature of the ode genre by modeling the acts of close reading and interpretation. The poet, in a sense, animates the urn's, quote, silent form, as he writes in line 44, by detailing the burning foreheads and parching tongues that it displays, and even turns the urn itself into a speaking entity. By the end, he effectively charges his readers to read the silent form of the poem the way he reads the silent form of the urn. Now onto the line. So I'll just read the final stanza in its entirety to situate the final lines properly in context. O Attic shape, fair attitude, with breed of marble men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and the trodden weed, thou, silent form, dost tease us out of thought as doth eternity, cold pastoral. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain, in the midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. We're told here that the urn, a friend to man, communicates the line in question, and I'll just note a few other mention-worthy details. First, the shift from contorted syntax earlier in the stanza to the straightforward expressions characterized by it, or carried by is, which appears twice in a single line, beauty is truth, that is all. And relatedly, the shift from the lyrical language of the first 48 lines of the poem to the final unadorned 2. Secondly, the return of ye from stanza 2, this time imbued with a vague referent. Does it refer again to the urn, to the man of the urn's address, to the reader? This ambiguous addressee twice occupies the prominent position of the poem's final line. Thirdly, the totalizing force of the repeated word all, that refers to both the reflexive statement about the relationship between beauty and truth, and the sum, as well as the limitation, of man's mortal wisdom. The deceptive confidence of this statement casts suspicion on the effort to reach such a version of contented closure. This is not, unlike earlier in the poem, when Keats's insistence on happiness, this is not unlike earlier in the poem, when Keats's insistence on happiness, the word appearing 6 times in 5 lines, merely calls that happiness into question. I think I got that here, yes. Ah, happy, happy boughs, that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu. And happy melodists, unwearied, forever piping songs, forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love. Here happy could mean happy, but happy, happy is downright suspicious. Okay, I'll now return to the lines in question. Fourthly, the gulf of space that fills the line break between lines 49 and 50, which without punctuation forces the statement "that is all" into an ironic position of self-negation. That is all is decidedly not all when it flows over to the next line. So it's here, it's just left hanging, and then it goes on. And finally, the intricacies of how beauty and truth as concepts are presented. Beauty is truth is followed immediately by a reflexive statement, truth beauty, that seems to enclose the relationship between the two concepts and leave no entry point for open thought or for further consideration. The circular relationship here begins and ends with beauty. Yet the statements are importantly not mirror images, as truth beauty awkwardly lacks a verb. Readers, then, are both barred structurally from intervening and forced to ponder this glaring imbalance that they cannot penetrate. So what does this tell us about how Keats envisions the relationship between beauty and truth? Critic Paul Sheets notes that, quote, "These 5 words have provoked a range of interpretation so wide as to elude determinate meaning. What is clear about this knotted chiasmus is its determination to identify 2 abstract nouns, frequently coupled in contemporaneous artistic and philosophical contexts, both admirable vessels for meaning supplied by the reader, idealist or materialist, aesthete or Marxist." In this case, Keats seems to invite readers to supply the final 2 lines with supplemental information. And I've created an inelegant schematic here. Perhaps beauty is a possible facet of, or a potential diversion from truth. Truth, a concept unencumbered or enriched by beauty. That is, hopefully not all ye know on earth, because it would mean that ye knows nothing. And obviously not all you need to know. Sorry, couldn't help doing that. I've intervened rather clumsily in these lines because I think the key concept in Sheets's reading is the dialogic dimension, which only the reader, someone outside of the silent form of the poem, can supply. Keats primes readers for this kind of thoughtful critical engagement through the nagging, characteristically Keatsian contradiction and ambiguity that emerge when one parses the end of the poem. The doubtful compatibility of beauty and truth in Ode on a Grecian Urn relates directly to the greater context of Keats's life and work. In particular, his concept of negative capability, itself a seeming oxymoron, bears upon how Keats values the uncertainty that he parodies with "that is all you need to know" at the end of the poem. So let's take a look at how Keats defines negative capability. This is, in his own words, a letter to his brothers from December of 1817. Several things dovetailed in my mind, and at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Coleridge, for instance, would let go by a fine isolated verisimilitude caught from the penetralium of mystery, from being incapable of remaining content with half knowledge. This pursued through volumes would perhaps take us no further than this, that with a great poet the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration. Keats here seems to value the state of half knowledge that he praises in Shakespeare's work and that he criticizes Coleridge for seeking to transcend. And the ambiguous sense of beauty that he mentions so enigmatically at the end of this letter parallels the abstract relationship that he creates between beauty and truth in Ode on a Grecian Urn. It also echoes his ambiguous meditation on the concept of beauty in one of his other odes from 1819, Ode on Melancholy. Line 21 reads, I'll just read this to you. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die. The tight repetition of beauty in this line promises an elaboration, which indeed we get, though it further obscures the concept. We're left then with Keats's letters and poetry that promote the value of truth as half knowledge, and the value of beauty in its contradictory, destructive, and generative power. It both obliterates consideration, as he notes in his letter, and it is itself obliterated when subject to consideration, as he details in Melancholy. In this way, Keats gives us fragments, unfinished and self-negating, rather than urns. Perhaps then, as good, dutiful, negative capabilitarians, we readers can find solace in the inability to piece these fragments together and find a definitive relationship between truth and beauty, as it appears to Keats, or as it appears in the poem, or as it appears in our lives. This is not to suggest critical or philosophical complacency, though, because neither Keats himself nor Shakespeare, his exemplar for fully realized negative capability, seems content to give up on trying to work through these concepts altogether. Rather, they seem to relish generative potential, or a kind of cooperative dialogic effort between the author and their work, whether work of art or play or poem, or between a text and its reader. This is, I believe, how Keats might define beauty as the reimagined truth of half knowledge in Ode on a Grecian Urn, in his letter to his brothers, and perhaps in his life. I want to leave you all with a question that I answered terribly in my PhD oral exam. I still passed somehow, but it's been plaguing me, but I think that's very Keatsian, and so I am going to push this off on you now. We know that Keats admires negative capability. Does he himself have it? Okay, thank you.